This panel is now about the journey forward from the Sandy Hook shootings. We began by looking back at the first hours and days. We walked through the experiences of one victim family. We've asked some very hard questions about social media. And now we're at that place, as journalists we sometimes find ourselves, where we're looking to figure out what the deeper and bigger questions are. How do we begin to investigate? How do we begin to find out about perpetrators? How do we begin to delve into some of the social issues beneath the surface of a horrific event? How do you keep the public's interest, and what kinds of innovations in reporting, in in-depth reporting, in investigative reporting, are necessary in order to tell a story with so much darkness and so much horror, and yet which is of such real urgency and importance to the public in Newtown, in Connecticut, and in the world, for that matter. So, briefly, to introduce the panel, and then I'll sort of sit down and join. On my immediate right, your immediate left, is Elaine Griffin of the Hartford Courant. Elaine, get the official biography out. We've known each other for a long time, so I feel like I don't need to read it, but I want to get my facts right. Elaine is a reporter at the Hartford Courant. She's been at the Courant since 2000, after working as a journalist in New Haven, in Florida, North Carolina, and California. She's won news and feature writing awards from the Society of Professional Journalists and New England Associated Press News Executives Association. She's also served on the Connecticut Judicial Branch's Public Access Task Force, charged with examining the openness and public accessibility of the courts. She also teaches at Southern Connecticut State University. Elaine is here because, among other things, she reported on Adam Lanza, on the shooter, and was featured in PBS Frontline, as were her current colleagues. Next to her, Jim McMillan. Jim is a longtime photojournalist and Dart Center Ochberg Fellow, participant in a week-long program that the Dart Center runs every year. He's also, if his bio is here, and again, I want to get it right. Where are you, Jim? There you are. He has a new job title. He's the new assistant director of the Center for Public Interest Journalism at Temple University, where he focuses on new programs and community development. Jim comes from the Lang Center for Civic and Social Responsibility at Swarthmore, where he also taught peace and conflict journalism. Jim McMillan also is here just because on top of his long and distinguished career as a photojournalist, he now edits something called the Gun Crisis Reporting Project, an independent, solutions-oriented, nonprofit news organization based in Philadelphia. It's a significant innovation in the reporting on gun violence, and that's why he's here today. Next to him is another old friend, Matt Kaufman from the Hartford Courant. Matt has been a reporter at the Courant since 1986 and is currently on the investigative desk. He also specializes in computer-assisted reporting and manages the newsroom's databases and intranet. In 2007, he was the winner of the DART Award for Excellence in Coverage of Trauma, along with his writing partner, Lisa Chetical, and a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Investigative Reporting for a series he co-authored on mentally ill troops sent to war. That remarkable series, which you can find on the Dart Center's website, has also received a Polk Award, the Selden Ring Award, the Worth Bingham Prize, and the Haywood Broun Award. And finally, next to him is Dr. Charles Herrick, who is the chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at Western Connecticut Health Network in Danbury. This is the mental health facility closest to Sandy Hook. Dr. Herrick obtained his undergraduate degree in biology from the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana, his MD from Southern Illinois University, His internship and residency in psychiatry were completed at the New England Medical Center, Tufts University School of Medicine in Boston, and then he completed a fellowship in child and adolescent psychiatry at the University of Southern California, San Francisco Langley Porter Psychiatric Institute. Dr. Herrick's experience has been both broad geographically and clinically, from working as an outpatient psychiatrist at Kaiser in South San Francisco to working as an inpatient and ER psychiatrist at the Jacobi Medical Center in the Bronx. He's been at Danbury Hospital, right next to Newtown, for the last 15 years, and chairman of the department since 2006. When not spending time with his family in Sandy Hook, says his official bio, you can find him with his family in the city swimming in the Hudson River. So, I'm going to move down here for this part of the conversation. And Elaine, I'm going to start with you, because this idea of one of the directions that we end up having to go as journalists in the aftermath of an incident like this, of Sandy Hook, or for that matter, Boston, just this week, is the story of the perpetrator. It makes a lot of people uncomfortable. It makes many victims uncomfortable. And it, in a challenging way, pulls the spotlight in some ways away from those who suffered and puts it onto a person who's committed a horrific series of acts. How did you approach that question here, especially because we have a perpetrator who is dead and who can't speak for himself and who can't give us evidence? How do you put together a story of someone who, first of all, is no longer with us, and secondly, who has committed a series of acts that most of us find really challenging to comprehend?
Well, I mean, I think some people don't even want to utter his name, so you can imagine getting an assignment in which you have to write about Adam Lanza. So there was no avoiding saying his name for both me and my colleague Josh Kovner at the Current. And nobody was talking. You can just imagine what it was like to go to Newtown and even mention his name to people. People just didn't really even want to talk about anything to do with him. So here we were, faced with some reporting that we had heard. There were some stories that were circulating. We didn't know if they were true or not. So we were also facing, how do you deal with information that might not be true? So it just goes back to the basics. We just started doing what we do every day with stories. We just started making phone calls, reaching out to people, reaching out to family members who were very reluctant to talk. Several family members they were very honest. They were fearful for their own families, fearful for their businesses, and they wanted to cooperate because they did feel that there were some aspects of Nancy Lanza in particular that were not accurate and that needed to come out. So we faced a lot of challenges in terms of trying to actually get accurate information. But as we proceeded with the story, we were able to learn various things about Nancy and Adam that actually debunked some of the reporting that was actually out there. But I will tell you this, some of the previous reporting made it difficult for us to reach out because I called a family member, and this particular family member said to me, "Why should I talk to you when it took the media 3 days to correct that Nancy wasn't a teacher at the school?" So, you're automatically faced with this challenge of having to sort of, you don't really want to defend erroneous reporting, but you're sort of faced with this idea of, they're sort of right. How am I going to convince a family member that our portrayal of things is going to be accurate when so much of what they have seen is not?
In addition to the sort of most obvious glaring facts that Nancy was not a teacher at the school, what were some of the other myths that you found yourself encountering? What did people get wrong, do you think?
Well, I get the sense that there was this whole idea of her as this doomsday prepper, that she was out there stockpiling arms, and that she was concerned about an economic collapse. And we didn't find that to be true. We did learn that she did purchase firearms, that she did a lot of shooting. She was a New England farm girl, and she learned to shoot at a very young age. She grew up on a farm, and in addition to her own history with firearms, she introduced them to her children. And when she introduced firearms to her oldest son Ryan, she felt that though Adam did have his issues, she felt that she didn't want to have Ryan a part of that culture and not have her other son a part of that culture. You know, whether you agree with it or not, that's sort of was her thinking. Why should I let one son do this when another one doesn't?
You had to make some interesting choices in actually how to tell the story. It's not just what you find out, but how you tell it. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that was, when two writers want to write, that can be somewhat difficult. But I don't know how many of you watched the Frontline episode, but that was very new for Josh and I. I've known Josh for 18 years. We've been reporting together for a long time. And when we knew that there would be a Frontline camera in the back of the car, that was something that we definitely, I can say we weren't very comfortable with it. When you're negotiating phone calls for a sensitive story, as all of you know, for lack of a better way of describing it, it's sort of like brokering a deal or trying to convince someone to talk to you. And we didn't want a lot of that kind of behind the scenes on television. So, we had these cameras following us at all times, in addition to trying to report this story for the Hartford Courant. So what we ended up doing is we did all of that reporting, and then we sat down together and sort of unfolded the story of what we were able to find out up until our deadline of what we knew about Adam and Nancy.
After, one other thing, and then maybe we'll move on to guns, but this is important. Often after a mass shooting or another mass casualty event, police, law enforcement, all kinds of agencies will spend a lot of time interviewing perpetrators, trying to find out what makes them tick. That's going on right now in Boston, right? Where one of the suspects is being interrogated probably right now. Adam couldn't do that, obviously. So you, in a way, are now the public's, anyway, you're the public's forensic examiner of this guy. You have to come up with an understanding of who he was and what happened. How is your understanding different of Adam Lanza? How is your understanding of him different from when you began the story? And how do you now understand, to the extent that one can, what happened leading up to December 14th?
Well, I think the reports from my colleagues, from sources that have shown that he had this sort of fascination, if you will, with mass killing, I think that definitely painted a pretty big portrait of what type of person he was. One of the things that Josh and I wanted to really get to the bottom of was his education, and the things that sort of led him to be, he was in school and he was taken out of school. Everything Adam Lanza started, he didn't finish. And his mother was a definite big part of that. He was in and out of school. Even when there were some high school officials that said he seemed to be doing well, all of a sudden he's yanked out of school. And, that was one of the things I definitely want to find out eventually, is what was that led him to be taken out of high school, because there were several people that felt that he was doing pretty well there. And, I guess for a lot of people, understanding Adam Lanza is sort of the one thing that everybody sort of wants to know. And the one thing I learned from this project is I've covered a lot of cases where the cases go to court, and I never realized before how court and the discovery that comes out of cases can be such a crutch to a reporter. If Adam Lanza was taken to trial, we would be learning so much more about him. I covered a very big case in Connecticut. It was the Cheshire home invasion case in Cheshire, Connecticut, and I covered the trials of both of those killers, and we learned so much about them in court. And to me, now we have this Adam Lanza. He'll never get taken to court. He won't have an attorney. We'll never really know everything we do need to know about him. Not that we ever find out everything, but it is a challenge to sort of investigate this ghost.
And we may come back to the Cheshire case because, another very emotional, very public murder case. But let's now go to another aspect of this, which is guns. One of the challenges for all of us as reporters is how to keep attention on a difficult issue. Public attention is there when there's been a mass shooting, but then it fades away. And one place where there is a massive amount of gun homicide is Philadelphia. Jim, you have a project that's designed to address that, and that's a kind of new way for journalism to go about this. Talk a little bit about what you do and where you think it leads you about journalism and guns and what needs to be done.
Thank you, Bruce, and thank you for having me, and thank you to everybody that made this happen, first of all, and everybody who's participating. The Gun Crisis Reporting Project, when you introduced me, is a nonprofit, solutions-oriented, and believe me, it's nonprofit, digital journalism community, almost, in Philadelphia. And we launched about a year ago, a little more than a year ago, and I could go on about all sorts of metrics and traffic and communities we serve and other services we provide. But really, we're filling a gap in reporting it's just really, frankly, an enormous reporting opportunity. I'm so reluctant to try to define Philadelphia at this forum. It's been a struggle for me all day. Nobody's trauma or loss is more legitimate than anyone else's. But the situation in Philadelphia is very different. A LaSalle University criminologist pointed out not long after Sandy Hook that 99% of the gun violence in America doesn't involve mass shootings. I could rattle off frightening statistics about Philadelphia all day, but we've got the leading rate of homicide per capita in major American cities since 2006. More people have been shot to death, just shot to death, in Philadelphia since September 11th than the total number of victims killed by terrorists on September 11th. There were lots of other perspectives. And yet, and for lots of reasons, due to media contraction and other complications, it's not very well reported at all. So last summer, I took a hard look at the digital versions, the websites of all of the Philadelphia major news organizations compared to our data from the police department, and found that 80% of the incidents were completely uncovered. In the coverage that we found, and I want to be fair to the few that do rich reporting, in the coverage that we found, 97% of the reports never mentioned root causes of violence or gun violence, or solutions. Newspaper reporting is often reduced to stenography of the police reports, and television reporting sometimes amounts to that plus fear-mongering. There's a lot of room for improvement. As I started to say, so we've got lots of metrics for what we've accomplished, but the one we didn't expect, the most amazing one is gratitude from people we meet in the field, from our digital communities, from people who email us and call us, that finally somebody's looking at the problem in context. So that's the problem side of our formula. We try to balance that with an equal solutions reporting. The most encouraging leads I've found so far come from public health and criminology, where innovations are showing double-digit reductions in some of the communities where they've been applied year after year. This makes us wonder why they're not applied more often. There are questions about scalability, replicability, and sustainability, but not so much about efficacy. There are things that work, and we're not doing them. So there's a lot of room for improvement. We're stepping away from some journalism, old traditions about objectivity. Mm-hmm. I'm not so concerned with adhering to old traditions as much as I am to just getting it right.
Tell us functionally, in sort of a typical week, what do you do at Gun Crisis that's going to be a little different from what would happen in a traditional newsroom? Mm-hmm. And what do readers and downloaders see, and how do they respond, and how does it work?
So there are 4 primary journalists working on it, including myself, Tara Murtha, who's here, a Dart fellow this year, who's reporting for the Dart Center today, and who's a writer with Philadelphia Weekly, and 2 photojournalists. We all have day jobs. This is entirely a volunteer effort so far, although we've got a bit of an economic strategy moving along at last. But it starts when I wake up in the morning and see what's happened overnight. It starts in my email, and it's a horror show of suffering delivered by the 2 guys who do most of the field work. It's in my email every day. It's in their viewfinder every night, but it's the 365-day reality for a lot of people in Philadelphia for all of their lives. And so I compare that with official sources, with other media reports. So there's a measure of aggregation and attribution and linking and attribution. So we have original reporting, and we compare and contrast and try to fill in the gaps. We don't spin our wheels on stories that everyone else is covering, but we try to go out when there's an opportunity to do something original. I think the most important difference is the way that our journalists collaborate with the community in the field. And it's very much an offshoot of the Dart ethos even though Tara and I are both I'm a former Octo fellow and Tara's a current fellow, it's rubbed off on the others. And they'll start rather than, well, I should put this in context. I come from this old tradition that Brad Cliff talked about this morning. I've done things, I've made mistakes due to competitive pressures. I haven't always treated people well. But what we've learned is that if we consider our responsibilities to everybody we cover, it also results in, I think, better journalism. And so Joe, one of the guys who's in the field most of the time, will more often just start by walking up and expressing his condolences, explaining what he's doing, why he's doing it, and asking if they agree that it's a good idea. That's the best case. That's the best practice. It's not like that every day, but that's what we strive for. And the response has been enormous. So then we're invited back to memorials. We're invited to follow the chronology of stories, rather than that sort of hit and run reporting, which frankly has employed photographers for most of my career. That's the ecosystem I came from.
Okay, Matt, Connecticut, where several of us at this table hail from, most of us, was the birthplace of the gun industry. And in the aftermath of Sandy Hook, you've been looking at guns in a new way. Talk a little bit about sort of how you began thinking about this and where it's taken you.
Right. Well, at the current, obviously, we were, tasked with covering everything that moved related to Sandy Hook and trying to understand it, both in an immediate sense and then in a broader sense as well. And obviously, there was a significant debate over guns, over gun violence, over access to guns. So I was asked to sort of look at kind of the cultural divide there. And it's an important story to tell. And if there are journalists, in the room here, one of the things I'd advise is to really understand the cultural divide over guns. I mean, if I were to ask for a show of hands here of, who thinks the First Amendment is critically important to our democracy, I suspect I'd see lots of hands go up. And if I were to ask, so we're in New York, if I were a state legislator and I had a bill introduced that would, outlaw pornographic images involving people dressed up as nuns, can I get your support for that? All the hands would go down. And the question I'd ask is, are you seriously telling me that if we ban, nun pornography, that the very next step is you're not allowed to criticize your government? That sense of, yes, but it's just off the table. We're First Amendment absolutists here. We don't even have that discussion. That very same passion exists among a very large swath of this country with respect to the Second Amendment. That there are some who really do believe that politicians do ultimately want to take their guns away. And some politicians have said things sort of along those lines. But nevertheless, I think journalists that probably, tend to not have a lot of familiarity with firearms, it kind of in this very divisive issue. I think, me personally, maybe because I've, spent a lot of time with it. I think it's more divisive than abortion. I think it's more divisive than equality for gays and lesbians. This is a nation cleaved into people comfortable with firearms and people not comfortable with firearms. And it's so difficult that we're talking about an object that is the ultimate offensive weapon and the ultimate defensive weapon. And it makes it sort of hard to kind of move the debate past. But, for, maybe not for everyone, but for the millions of people who said, boy, if Sandy Hook doesn't get these gun nuts to change their positions, I don't know what will. There were millions of pro-gun people saying, boy, if Sandy Hook doesn't get these gun grabbers to change their positions, I don't know what will. And it really is important as journalists, if we're going to cover this debate, to understand that divide. So, I dove in, and that 10-minute rant shows you
And you dove and found yourself swimming where?
We originally thought of looking just at the divide in Newtown. In Connecticut, a wealthy, liberal state with a strong tradition of gun manufacturing, but not, the first state on everyone's lips about, a strong gun culture here. In fact, several months before the shooting, there had been a debate in Newtown about sort of unrestricted outdoor shooting that was seen as the kind of a nuisance by a lot of people. They drafted some legislation that would just sort of put some limitations on when literally you could go out in your backyard and fire off, semi-automatic weapons. And there was a huge backlash among people in Newtown about that, saying, what don't you understand about shall not be infringed. It was seen by a number of people in Newtown as a Second Amendment issue. We ended up kind of broadening it to the divide in Connecticut, to the divide in the U.S. And what we found is, as much as there were people who very much wanted to make this any sort of demographic divide, this is about the South and the mountain states versus the coasts. This is about more educated people versus less educated people. As the wealthier, this divide exists everywhere, very much in our state. If anyone was watching the debate in our legislature over gun legislation, thousands came out on both sides to support extremely passionately about this issue. And really, I found it really educational, just how strong that divide was everywhere in the country, including in Connecticut.
And with an issue this volatile and emotional under any circumstances, let alone in the shadow of one of the worst killings in American history, what kinds of narrative choices did you make? How do you tell a story? How do you navigate it for your readers?
For me, I had the luck of because, like Elaine, I was doing something with Frontline, so we were working on this an awful long time. And so at the inevitable point, when I have the meeting with my editor where I turn in a story that would take a week and a half to read, and he tells me how long it can be, and then I act like a diva and we fight, that having spent this much time, and we did almost 40 interviews, that first off, I was able to say, you got to give me a ton of space. This is an issue of great national import. People are looking to the Hartford Courant for some leadership on this, and let's do this story right. And so, sort of step one was I had a lot of space to work with, and then from that, I kind of wrote the story that we did in chapters, partly to make it manageable, but to let people kind of have their say. And there were a number of people and groups of people with different perspectives on the issue, and gave them sort of honestly and fairly, without loaded language and sneering kind of asides and the like, just say their piece. And I got decent feedback after it from both sides, and even from some people sort of grudgingly say, well, I guess I can I don't agree, but I guess it was okay that you didn't make the other side, again, whichever side we're talking about, look really as crazy as I think they are. So I think this was, I could have added noise to the divisive gun debate and pushed the envelope nowhere on that. I thought there was just value of listen to really what people had to say, and being with Frontline when we're not doing 5-minute interviews, we're doing 90-minute interviews. It really helped that, and say, let's just lay out these people's perspective and let people agree or disagree.
And where, the Connecticut legislature now has passed, and the governor has signed this fairly broad bill that both introduces a wide range of restrictions on guns and magazines and so on, and it sets up a little bit different mental health infrastructure. Where do you think the gun issue in Connecticut is going to go from here, or are we done with it? Where do you think the story goes?
Well, the story goes to the courts. That we will see challenges to our laws. There's certainly a number of pro-gun people who are sort of looking for a good test case, be it New York's law, Connecticut's law. I will tell you, most states that have passed legislation after Newtown have passed legislation enhancing gun rates, making it easier to get a gun, expanding the number of places you can carry a gun. To the extent that there was a Newtown effect on gun legislation, it is not the way many legislators thought it was going to go. But in terms of Connecticut, the courts will decide whether under a couple of the Heller decision, the McDonald decision, the Supreme Court that kind of set the parameters for the Second Amendment, whether these laws are too great a restriction under the Second Amendment. I suspect these specific restrictions will hold up under the current court's decision in those cases, but it's definitely going to court.
Okay. Dr. Herrick, let's change the focus a little bit to mental health, which Matt brought up, but it's striking how much mental health themes are threaded throughout this story, from the question of Adam Lanza and his life and motivations and acts, to the challenges facing survivor families and the Newtown community, and Connecticut's mental health system and peer mental health first aid and so on. It's called for in the new bill. As a clinician, as a psychiatrist who has worked closely with the Newtown community and as someone who's active in the state, what stories do you think need to be told? What issues need to be illuminated in this next phase of searching a little more deeply around Sandy Hook and the events of December?
Well, let me first start by saying, getting back to what was said earlier today about the speed with which information is driven to us. We don't even receive it anymore. It just comes to us. Yeah. And the amount, just the sheer mass of information. I was talking to Pat Lodra earlier today, and I had 1,300 emails in the first week that this happened. She had 28,000. So just the amount of information is so overwhelming, it's hard to sift through it. And I think if there's anything the press really should be responsible for, it's sifting through that information and helping the public be informed to know what information is really critical. Because what is the point after all? I mean, it's not just a voyeuristic thing, but it's meant to not only inform but hopefully change things for the better. Mm-hmm. With respect to mental health, I was at a dinner party Christmas Eve, and a friend of mine said, obviously the guy was crazy, and I said, I don't think so. And he looked at me like I was crazy. Like, how could you say that? Oh, but you're a psychiatrist, so he paid lip service to my credentials, but otherwise, he felt that there was nothing I could say or do that would ever change his opinion. Mm-hmm. And I think this idea of mental illness in the press has been perpetrated. I think the Current ran an editorial shortly after the Boston bombing suggesting that here's another example of a need to address the mental health system, which was interesting because ultimately the decision, ultimately it appears that this was a terrorist act, but I really wanted to see this also as a terrorist act. Insofar as it is a rare event and yet it draws a tremendous amount of attention, and that's exactly what terrorism seeks to do. And people may have mental illness, but just because they have mental illness does not mean that is the reason for why they do what they do. I mean, they still are people, first and foremost. They still have hopes and dreams and desires. They want to be famous. They want to be on stage. So I think that bringing up the idea that it's mental illness stops the conversation. And it really doesn't allow us to move forward and to understand better what the problem is. Because I see it as a larger problem in society. And that people have a need in our culture to be on stage. And we celebrate celebrity independent of how one gets there. And I think that in some ways that's hijacked what we really intended in terms of our ideas about becoming famous by doing something, doing good works. I think the press talks about mental illness in two ways. They talk about mental illness as a euphemism for evil. And this is very common. We all use it. I use it. It's reasonable and expectable, and we shouldn't make anything more of it than that. But the press also, the responsible press also talks about mental illness. And when we talk about evil, we talk about he's the guilty party. The press also talks about mental illness in a responsible, and I put that in quotes, in a responsible manner, which is that mental illness is this biologically driven underlying disorder that needs treatment, and that somehow the system failed that individual if they go on to commit some heinous crime. And there are nice, clear borders to the idea. And it's nice and clear because they can watch it on TV and be fascinated and also say, well, that's not me. I don't have that. That'll never happen to me. And you see this on Nova and Frontline and other ideas. I think there was a blog that came out that got a lot of press. I am Adam Lanza's mother. And I think this is an example of that. But the real world of treating the mentally ill, the world that I deal with, is a very messy world. There are no clear borders. There's no division between mad and bad. And that's lost. And in that, there's no blaming the system. There's no blaming the individual. We just feel guilty. The people who provide treatment to these individuals, and I speak firsthand, but I also speak for my colleagues, when something like this happens, there is a tremendous amount of guilt that is experienced by those who are treating these people. And it's frightening. Whether or not he had somebody treating him, my first thought was, oh my God, I feel bad for this guy if he's caring for this person. Because it's impossible to be able to predict these things. As much as we like to think, well, if only the system were better, we would be able to identify these individuals. Do you know how many college students in the last year have had homicidal ideas? 70%. 70% report homicidal ideas in the last year. What do we do with that? So you have to put it in context, even if they have mental illness, to be able to understand really what motivates them. And getting more information isn't necessarily going to give us the answers. And just by way of example, think about Adolf Hitler. Ron Rosenbaum, I believe is a journalist, wrote a book explaining Hitler. And he discusses all of the different reasons why Hitler may have done what he did, the Holocaust. And there is no clear answer. And we have more information on Hitler than we have. He was probably the most transparent public figure that existed. And we still don't know ultimately what drove him to do what he did. And there's still debate going on. So I'm not sure that getting more information about Adam Lanza is necessarily going to ultimately solve our problems. Mm-hmm. Now, one final thing in terms of the press and the recovery of Newtown. We're not the same people in public as we are in private. And when we're in front of the cameras, we tend to exaggerate our pluses and minuses. We like to please. And if we think that people are looking for us to be a victim, we will play that up. If they think we're looking for us to be the hero, we'll play that up. It's not conscious, but it's there. And I think the attention that Newtown has received by the press has magnified that impact. And I think ultimately it slowed the recovery of the town.
Mm-hmm. Let me push you on one thing. You've now been doing clinical work in Western Connecticut for a long time, and Danbury for a long time. You know the community, you know the system, you know its flaws and its strengths. If I'm an investigative reporter and I'm as one corner of this, I'm trying to figure out what parts of the mental health safety net might have, what elements of a mental health safety net might have done a better job of catching someone like Adam Lanza, regardless of this case. Where should we be looking as journalists?
Well, if you look at the bills that are going before the state currently, none of them, if they become statutes, have captured or will capture someone like Adam Lanza. There's a lot of focus on committed outpatient treatment, but one needs to have committed some sort of act of violence like Kendra's Law here in New York. And Adam Lanza was not violent prior to his act. And I'm not clear, at least nobody's reported this in the press, that he ever even expressed a violent thought. And do you know how many kids are preoccupied with violent video games or military wars or mass killings? I'm just not clear in my mind that there is an easy solution from a mental health perspective. I think the safest solution, obviously, is to keep guns away from people who are prone towards those types of things. But that gets back to gun legislation.
Are there nonetheless some places in the mental health system that reporters should be looking and asking questions about?
Well, there are a lot of problems with the mental health system, not just locally, but statewide as well as nationally. It's a very challenging thing because there are limited dollars to go around, and we all know that our healthcare system is broken. So states in the nation have to prioritize where they're going to put their dollars. And they have to make very hard choices about whether it's going to be in mental health care or whether it's going to be in trauma care or whether it's going to be in cancer care. And that really requires a national debate. But it's simple economics.
Let's do some questions from the room and we'll continue the conversation. Anyone?
Genevieve Bellmaker from the Epoch Times. I have a question that's a little bit different than what we've been talking about, but I'm curious about the mental health of reporters who covered these stories, particularly when it's like day after day and it goes on sometimes for months or longer. How you deal with that, how you sort of handle moving through that and still do your job. that's for any of you.
Yeah, and I should say this is a huge and very important issue in which there are a lot of resources on the Dart Center's website. It's something we think about a lot. How did your newsroom cope with this at the current? You guys were immersed not just in your own work, but the whole newsroom really, and because of Bill, even more intimately than usual.
Right. Well, I mean, Elaine, you've done more of this and had to deal with more of it. I think, I mean, there was, a fair amount of open crying in the newsroom, which you don't often see or think about and associated with a newsroom, but there was a lot of it. But I think we all also understood we really had a job to do, and kind of focused on that. And I will tell you, it sort of hadn't especially occurred to me, sort of the emotional trauma, and again, not to put this anywhere on the plane that the folks in Newtown were dealing with, but nevertheless, we were immersed in it more than average people away from it, and certainly when we learned about Bill's stepdaughter, that made it quite difficult. But it was an email from you, Bruce, saying, I just want, can you spread the word that there are resources available for reporters struggling with this, that it sort of struck me just sort of how difficult this was. But Elaine will be better for this because you've had to deal with so many more difficult stories than I have.
Yeah, I mean, I think that our editor had sent out an email to the staff saying, if anybody needs to talk to somebody, it's available there. And when I saw that email, to be quite honest with you, I had wished that I had received that email previous when I had covered long, drawn-out, horrific cases in court. Because when you're sitting in court, you're seeing this evidence day in and day out, and you sort of don't really think it's affecting you, but it does start to affect you. I mean, there are some photographs from cases I've covered that will stay with me forever. And to be honest with you, when I saw that email, I actually responded to the entire staff and said, I don't know if you remember, I said, please, if anybody feels that they need to get some help or talk to someone, do it. Because I do know that the case that I had covered in Connecticut, a number of reporters had sought some counseling after that. And if you don't have strong support at home, I do. I have my husband and I have a 10-year-old daughter who can bring levity to any situation. So I think when I saw that email, I was really heartened. So I guess what I'd say in answer to your question is you need to make sure you sort of take charge of your own emotions so that you can be sort of the better reporter. And to editors out there, reach out to your reporters and make it clear to them that help is there. I have really great editors at the Current, and they do that. But it was great to see, a company-wide email go out saying, "Look, if you need to talk, talk." So just sort of be a champion for your reporters when you don't think maybe they can do it for themselves.
Okay. Yeah.
Stephen Marins, thank you very much for the panel. I have no questions about the volume of coverage that this terrible tragedy in Newtown received, nationally and internationally. But Jim, you raised two questions that I actually, from a journalistic point of view, would really appreciate hearing from the panelists respond. You pointed out that statistically, that the volume of people killed by firearms are far outweigh the numbers that are affected by mass murders. Dr. Herrick is pointing out again how unusual, extremely unusual mass murders are, as horrible as they are. But you also said something else, which is there's often a failure to report on what we know about both the causes and the solutions to the more common deaths and injuries associated with crime and firearm violence. Having just finished serving as a member of the Attorney General's Task Force on Children Exposed to Violence, and as a regular reader and consumer of media, I'm curious as to what your take is on why how are those decisions made, and why do we see such a lopsided or disproportionate lack of coverage about both the numbers and the issue of solutions that you mentioned?
Thanks. It's a terrific question. I worry a lot less about how we got here and think more about how we can move along and produce better journalism. I started when I went to Swarthmore. I went to Swarthmore a few years ago and discovered for myself the discipline of peace and conflict journalism, and studied for a year before teaching a course on the topic. And I want to mention that because when I looked into that, the complaint about, and I'll get back to your question because it's a long way around, but it's worth it. The quarrel with war reporting is not only that there's a bias toward violence, but that it often just regurgitates the voices of the elites. It doesn't represent all of the stakeholders. It doesn't look at the conflict's chronology, what peace before the conflict, peace after, peace within the conflict. And when I started thinking about all of the requirements of good peace and conflict journalism, it reminded me of when I taught basic reporting at Missouri a few years ago and said, you know what, this is just good reporting. That if a student went off to cover a school board meeting and only had a quote from the president and not the teachers, or didn't talk to the students or the neighbors or bus driver or whatever was appropriate to the story, that's about a C in journalism school. So why we accept this? And so what was interesting is when I went to present to the faculty at Swarthmore on teaching peace and conflict journalism, a guy who lives in Philadelphia came up and said, couldn't you say all of that about gun violence or about violent crime in Philadelphia? And I said, yeah, absolutely. You're kind of bringing me back to the kind of reporting that I used to do, and that's one of the critical legs of the stool in this project. So if we don't accept it from undergraduate journalism students, I don't know why we accept it from. And frankly, we see it more often in the traditional media. But the next problem is it's not being done at all because of contraction in the media, and also in new media, it's difficult to monetize bad news. So how are we going to get a way out of this? And it'll probably be some evolution of social media journalism. I mean, the labels don't really work, but collaboration across the communities that we used to think of as journalism and audiences to tell the whole story and to reorganize the information. The information's out there, as we heard today. So why, we have to look at why it isn't getting to the audience and what we can do to improve it. So in our little microcosm of Philadelphia, we've got a little project that's working. But sustainability is going to be a problem. The reporting paradigms, it's not difficult to do. It's just easier to be lazy.
I think there may be something else, too. I'll just throw something into this, and I wonder if any of you have any thoughts on it. It does seem to me that our definition of what's news, handed down for the last 150 years, often has to do with what's big, with what's new or different, with what's least typical. And whether it's here in New York or in Philadelphia or in Newtown or in New Haven, where I live, what is the violence that is most typical is the kind that's least likely to generate headlines. We're giving the public a kind of inverted pyramid of coverage, inverted pyramid of threat analysis based on what's most ordinary. The big threat may be from what's most ordinary, and yet it's easier for us to define as news someone going into an elementary school and shooting a couple of dozen children than it is to look at the number of gun homicides and their causes in Hartford and New Haven and Bridgeport, as Governor Malloy has pointed out, or in Philadelphia or anywhere else. So I think that's part of it too. There is, and one of the reasons that Jim's project is so interesting is that it does challenge the notion of what's front page. You say, if it's gun homicide, let's look at it.
You're off to a good start, and I've been working on this as well. We're working on a tool to analyze news coverage in Philadelphia at Temple University now. But I've got some rough numbers just from looking at news feeds in Philadelphia, and I see that most of the coverage, about 90% of the coverage, goes to stories with easy labels: stray bullets, innocent bystander, caught in the crossfire, multiple victims, a child, a police officer, and a few other things I'm probably forgetting. At first glance, about 90% of the gun violence in Philadelphia doesn't fit under any of those banners. If news value calls for a deviation from the norm, novelty, and if we can see that roughly one person has been killed every day over the last 25 years in Philadelphia, well, then the one person killed today isn't in itself a deviation. Yeah. And by old metrics, it's not news.
Yeah. Over here.
Hi, Jordan. Hello. was it here? I'm sorry about that. Craig Ruddle. I'm a photojournalist, and I did spend roughly 10 days in Newtown covering. And I want to make a comment first, and it's just a bit of irony in regards to the reporting, but probably on the anniversary of the date, the Friday after the 14th, there was a vigil, and it happened to be if there's anybody here from that area, I believe it's a park. It's part of the town where they have government offices, and it's like I believe it's a former mental hospital.
Fairfield Hills.
Yeah, and it's a former mental hospital. So here is this mass vigil with thousands, maybe a couple thousand people, and in the background this old building that at one time was this mental facility, part of the state's operation, which is now shuttered. I found some irony in that, considering it had been reported. But the question I have is to Dr. Herrick is, at the very beginning of your comments, you had said that, and I'm loosely going by what you said, but you said that being famous is very important to people, and perhaps are you suggesting that people will put their humanity aside just to be famous? Is that really, are you suggesting perhaps that, at least in part, that was an intent of Adam Laza because he needed to be famous versus it was so important that humanity became secondary?
Well, I really can't speak for the shooter's motives, but I do believe that our culture often places celebrity above everything else. And how one gets there becomes really secondary than getting there. And I think not our social media, but our television, reality TV, and things of this nature, I think show that. So not to be critical, but to be critical, I think that does exist in our culture, and I think it's a problem.
Okay. Hi, Dave Cullen. I wrote a book on Columbine. Charles, I wanted a couple questions. I wanted you to clarify the 70% figure, because I thought that was fascinating. Was it, and I want to get my tweet right, was it 70% of college students thought about homicide or fantasized?
Had a homicidal thought in their last year.
And how do we know that?
Well, I know it from Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, which is on the fall of violence historically over the years. So he quoted it. So I'm quoting Pinker's quote of him.
Well, I'm just curious. Do they do surveys or something of students?
I'm not sure how the study was designed.
Okay.
But in the book, he does say that one of his students yelled out, "The other 30% are lying." These were male students, by the way.
That probably does make a big difference. I was wondering if anybody else on the panel wanted to comment on the whole idea of red flags and how easy they are to sort of see in retrospect, and if you think we overplay this idea that was obvious.
I was fascinated by the fact that the FBI interviewed one of the bombers a year ago and cleared him. So if the FBI can miss reading a bomber, what can that show us in the mental health field? I mean, being able to predict future violence is just an impossible task, and there's just no way around it.
Elaine, did you have any thoughts on that? You having looked at this shooter so closely, and even some of I'm thinking of the Pettit case and others.
Well, I guess in the Cheshire home invasion case, the red flags were there. Joshua Komzarjewski, he had this long history of breaking into people's homes, burglarizing them with night vision goggles. The red flags were there on that one. Stephen Hayes, he was the other defendant in this case. Both, incidentally, are on death row in Connecticut. They're part of the group that still faces the death penalty, although there's going to be argument tomorrow at the Supreme Court on that whole issue of whether or not it's retroactive. So the red flags were there, criminal history, whatnot. I think in Adam Lanza's case, like I was saying before, had he stayed in school, in the system, maybe those flags would have been there for someone else to see. He killed his mom. And his mom clearly was the one person who probably knew the most about him. What was interesting to me, and I've tried to see if the father would speak with me. I've tried on numerous occasions to get him to talk to me. There was something in 2010 that just made him cut his father off, if indeed what his father is telling me is true, or what I've been told from people that know him. There was something in 2010 that really just set Adam off, that made him cut off both his father and his brother. And there were the divorce was going on. He was getting remarried. We don't know if those were the key. But the one thing that I've always thought about with Adam, you were talking about the need to be famous and all of that. I don't know. I haven't seen anything with that. But the little girl that said he looked very angry. I think the whole anger issue, and I don't know. This is just a guess on my part, but perhaps when the report comes out and police release all of that, his anger issues will really tell us perhaps what drove him to do what he did.
Okay. Any live stream questions come in?
Yeah, we have a couple actually. From live stream, Monica Rogers wants to know, as a culture, what are 3 things that the doctor would recommend we do differently, such as no video games or parenting differently, that kind of thing?
Doctor?
God. Look, I mean, to me, it's about community. It's about a network. And clearly studies demonstrate over and over again, the stronger there is a network and there's a community. I think the principal said it earlier today about communication, open and available communication is critical. Obviously, there are red flags with respect to Adam Lanza. He was uneducated. He was isolated. He was going nowhere with his life. But that's true with, 95% of the kids that are referred to me. So I just, find it very difficult to prescribe some sort of recommended treatment. But ultimately, you look at rates of mental illness. Our rates of mental illness are no different, serious mental illness are no different in our society than in Western Europe. Our rates of personality disorders are no different. So what distinguishes us from Western Europe? Why are we violent and Western Europe is not?
Let me push you slightly. You said, okay, it's all about community, and that's good. If you're in a room full of journalists, among others, who are trying to figure out how to tell that story, what the indicators are, what the measures are, not to explain the Newtown shooter, but to try to be good watchdogs of our social safety net, whether it's in Connecticut or anywhere else. From your point of view, from your experience as a clinician, where should the journalists in this room or on the live stream be looking in order to begin to investigate whether in mental health and other key social safety related areas we're really doing as good a job on community as we can? Where should we be looking?
Well, I think one of the things that the principal of Newtown High School mentioned was a psychiatrist that is working there, John Woodall, who's working on building resiliency among kids. And I think that's an interesting and compelling story. He's been in Uganda and helped with victims suffering traumatic experiences there. And I think focusing on community connections and community resilience are going to be an interesting part, and it's those people who fall through the safety nets, so to speak, if you consider that a safety net, that are perhaps the red flags that earlier we were asked to call upon. And so it's, the challenge, though, in journalism, I agree, it's not sexy, so who's going to read it?
Well, but that's the pros here. They're the ones who get people to read it. Next question in the room. Yeah.
Hi, Janice Astor, WIA. Quick question. You mentioned, Dr. Herrick, terrorism before, and I wondered if the panel could share their thoughts about why some events are characterized as terrorist attacks, why some perpetrators are characterized as terrorists, like in the Boston bombing, for example, whereas in mass shootings, they're not classified or defined as terrorists or terrorist attacks. Who makes that decision, and how does it affect coverage?
Anyone?
I think from my perspective, it's ideology. And I think if there's a ideology that's political or religious in nature, then they're defined as a terrorist. But if it's personal, then it's a mass shooting. So I see that, but that's not a scientific decision. That's a cultural, that's a societal decision. They may have the same brains, but different motives for different reasons. So I feel strongly about characterizing this incident as a form of domestic terrorism. I personally see it that way. We would not be sitting here today talking about this if it were one child or one teacher. The fact that it has created such a huge amount of attention and press, to me, from my perspective, is what defines terrorism, the attention that it draws. And I believe that, and I again, it's speculation, I believe that that was intentional. One doesn't choose to do that without understanding what will happen as a consequence.
Matt and Elaine, I'm curious, was there any internal debate at the Current about whether to apply terrorism as an adjective to this, as a word to this, noun rather?
None that I was aware of.
No, but I think the thing we need to remember is, isn't it interesting that there's all this writing that we've been told about that Adam Lanza had left behind? It's going to be very interesting to see what he said in those journals, and perhaps it's a good question you asked. Perhaps maybe we're going to learn more about him in terms of the word, terrorism, and it's not just the press response when in dealing with terror. It's also how schools and towns have reacted too, because It's a really good question you asked, because schools now are doing lockdown drills all across Connecticut. Some are considering hiring armed guards at their schools. So yes, I guess it really is a good question for a newsroom.
And some of it may go to intent. I mean, if was there an intent to create lasting fear? And I sort of think that's one of the key components of terrorism. It's fair to assume in a 9/11 type thing that was not let's try to kill a couple thousand people. Let's try to damage this society going forward. And we don't know from Sandy Hook. I think the initial assumption was it was a troubled kid who said let's kill a lot of people. And maybe we'll know later. Was he thinking about the lasting impact, and was he hoping to leave that impact in terms of what schools are now doing, what legislatures are now doing?
Okay. Hi, Mike Patrick from the Republican American newspaper in Waterbury, Connecticut. This is a question for Dr. Herrick. You had mentioned earlier that labeling crazy or mental illness, or using that as an answer to why someone did something like what happened in Newtown, tends to stop the questioning. People say, okay, well, of course, he was crazy. There's his picture, crazy picture, and then, we have our solution. Journalists, I think, kind of, because we're human, we look for that answer too, and we also tend to, perhaps, people turn to us for for answers, and we provide it for them. Okay, there he was. He had mental illness. How do we approach, as journalists, folks like yourself, in a way that would keep the line of questioning open? How do we refrain from using that immediate, or looking for that immediate answer? And is there a way that we as journalists can approach folks like yourself to keep that line of questioning open and to keep the dialogue more positive? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, when you start asking psychiatrists questions, the presumption is always the perpetrator must have been mentally ill. That's why I'm interviewing a psychiatrist as opposed to an FBI agent or somebody else. So, again, as I said earlier, people with mental illness commit crimes all the time for the same motives that we see other people commit crimes. I mean, just because one has a mental illness does not explain the motives behind their act. So to open the conversation further, you need to explore further. So, one of the things that came out in the news with regard to Adam Lanza was Asperger's. I can't tell you how many clinicians got phone calls from anxious mothers because their children had Asperger's. And that's kind of what I'm talking about in terms of trying to keep the conversation open, because Asperger's is not a red flag. And so why it would be used in the press as an explanation, I think, did not follow the DART Center's tip sheets on, using the press in a responsible manner.
Well, I think that was one of the things that some journalists did want to try to clarify is, see, remember, his medical reports have not been released. That's one of the issues with public access right now is, and I've talked to some prosecutors who have quietly said, let's just release the report so we could see if there was something that Adam Lanza was dealing with, what it is, and see if it had any type of effect on what happened. And those records still have not been released. So I think to some degree, when something like this happens, there is this push for public access because we want to see if there is a record that maybe reflects. Maybe it won't ever tell the story, and maybe it won't ever give us the explanation, but isn't it better to be armed with the most information so that perhaps there is an avenue that we can explore that might have maybe answered a few more questions? So I was wondering, Doctor, how do you feel about when those reports come out? You think it is important for the public to see Adam Lanza's health reports, his medical reports?
I'm not sure that it will answer the questions that we're looking for. As I said, I mean, suppose he was seen and he was found to be depressed. Would that explain why he did what he did? Young men who are depressed are often angry, and they express their depression in that type of situation. I think that that's a facile answer, and I think that it will, to my mind, do more damage to those who actually struggle with depression, and it will not explain exactly what motivated him to do what he did. Mm-hmm. So, I think the reason why the records have not been released has to do with HIPAA. So I'm not sure, given the fact that he's deceased, that those records will ever be released. I don't know that for a fact. Probably it will get sorted out in the courts, but I'm not sure it'll answer the questions.
We should say that on the next panel we'll have Dave Cullen, who spent a decade looking at Columbine, including the mental health histories of the perpetrators, and we'll see where that conversation leads. One more question.
Brad Clift, photojournalist, freelance in Connecticut. First of all, I wanted to say to Elaine and to Matt that actually it's really commendable that you guys did the Frontline story. The reason for that is that journalism suffers from a thing that most American companies don't suffer from, and that's tireless self-promotion. One of the problems with journalism from an observer's point of view for the 7 years I didn't do it was that you don't explain enough what you're doing and how you do it, but more importantly, why you do it. And it has a huge function not only in democracy, but in trying to get people to understand. Having said that, I have a son who has Asperger's, so I panicked as everybody else did. But then I know my son really well. But it also speaks to something you brought up, and you brought up too, Doctor, and that is that if the FBI couldn't catch the guys in Boston, the thing that I was wondering is, how could you even have your son, if you thought he was violent, hand him a gun? She never thought that it was even possible for him to be violent. Otherwise, why would she go target practicing with him? But that also speaks to something we need to do a little bit more of, which is self-criticism as a way to make ourselves better, improve the profession. And one of those things is the problem with some of the journalism as well as psychiatry is that we tend to look at these things as being the solutions when in fact there are limitations to both psychiatry and journalism. We can't always be thorough. You can't always know things, and we're trying to advance both of those things at a time when we look to doctors as being gods and journalism is always finding out everything. The fact of being a journalist for 35 years, what I discovered is we know about maybe 10% of what's going on in government, or maybe we got to the tip of the iceberg that's going on below the criminal justice system, or what's going on with criminals, or what's going on with corruption. We very rarely get to the bottom of any of that stuff. So we're talking about limitations here. Psychiatry is not a panacea for everything, and journalism doesn't explain everything. We're lucky if we can explain anything. So those are some comments that I wanted to put out there. And like I said, with my son, I was thinking the same things, but it also brings up something really, really important that I would look into if I was doing research in psychiatry, and that is there's a bigger issue here of fitting in, and that is an American thing. It's probably a societal thing in all societies, probably even bigger in Asian societies, and that is if you reach the age of 19 or 20 and you have no place to fit in and you're not part of this, whether it's immigrants coming in or whether it's a young man who has Asperger's or autism. If you don't fit in, then what does that mean for the rest of your life? And are you hopeless enough at that point to do something really violent because you're really angry that you don't fit in, especially in a society that even now more makes you want to fit in? These are just observations, but as a journalist and as a father, something that I've done here as a resident of Connecticut.
And the broad philosophical is probably a good kind of bookend for a conversation about going deeper. Any kind of closing thoughts, either in response to Brad or things we should say?
You give psychiatry way too much credit. And I agree, and this gets back to the idea of community and connectedness, because if you can identify those kids early on who are not fitting in, you can get to know them better and help them to find a community to fit in.
You can get them jobs as reporters. You can get them a job as a reporter.
Exactly.
Brad, picking up on what you had said about the profession maybe not doing a very good job of sort of explaining what it does, I have been thinking of late that we sort of need to rethink the role of journalists, not remake the role, but rethink the perception of the role of journalists. There were two things that sort of led me to this. I was watching right after the bombing in Boston. I was in Florida. I was in the back of a car looking at sort of shaking video on my iPhone. And right after the blast, there was what appeared to be a professional photojournalist, based on where he was, a videographer, sort of very quickly moving toward the blast. And within 30 seconds or so, a police officer shoot him away. And I thought, what a stupid idea that was. I mean, you've got a very active crime scene. You've got someone capturing it professionally, and you're going to shut him down, or she, as a member of the media, and that struck me as odd. And then I was on a panel a few weeks ago with the Connecticut Daily Newspaper Association, and someone there had asked, did we really need to have that many journalists in Newtown? Couldn't we have sort of cut them a little break there? And do we need that many satellite trucks? And I thought from that, and the impact that had on the town. And I imagined the scene at the firehouse immediately afterward with these terrified parents and terrified children. And you had scores of police officers there with semi-automatic or fully automatic weapons. You had unknown numbers of police cars. There were helicopters in the sky. And all of that must have been scary and traumatic. But nobody would say, God, do we really need that many cops on the scene there? Could you put the helicopters away until the kids don't have to see it? I mean, everyone understood that the police officers had a role to play there. And I'd make sort of a modest proposal that in a tragedy like this, the media has a role to play as well. And it is an unpleasant role and sometimes a difficult role and a role that is going to upset people. But I sort of put this modest proposal out there that journalists ought to be seen to some extent as first responders as well. And it's not purely a voyeuristic thing. I mean, there are people we know all over the world who had, deep and authentic concern for the people of Sandy Hook and what had happened there, and also people, certainly it's the case in Boston, who needed information about what was going on there. And the media play a pivotal role in that. So that'll kind of be my final rant on it, that it may be time to rethink and sort of, we need to do our part as well, but to respect the role of journalists in covering a mass tragedy and think of us as sort of just another essential first responder with a difficult job to do.
Well, and let me say, maybe by way of closing, because we're out of time, got to land the plane here, that Matt and Elaine, you can watch them doing their job, and as in kind of public explanation of the work of reporters in the aftermath of Sandy Hook, at Frontline's website, right, and at the Current's website as well. The Sandy Hook documentary that features the two of you is there. So thank you, Dr. Herrick, Matt, Jim, Elaine. Conversation continues. This is set off some huge themes that I think will resonate in our next panel on where the story goes from here. Let's take 15 minutes, come back, take it from there. Thanks, guys.